Some of these I'm going to. About theology of play, just telling my story. But I actually was introduced to games and really were led me down this path to really embrace the idea of theology of play through this game right here. How many of you have heard of settlers of Catan in the culture, or have anyone made references to Catan? If you went up to Montrose and you see the guy that is advertised his name says Caitlin or something like that, they've even taken some of the graphic or artwork. This is a game that is that basically you're building there's an island that's built, and you're sort of one of these colors, and you're putting little settlements and little roads, and you need resources to do that. And it's just, but this game was in 2002. I was in Germany working at the American Protestant Church in Bonn, and we were on a church retreat, and I had a friend who said, I want you to play, I have this game I want you to play. And honestly, I was like, that's great. Like, I wasn't excited about it. I didn't, but his enthusiasm intrigued me. But he sets us up and he makes this island grid, and he explains his game. And basically this grid that has these 5 different resources, wheat or on 1 to 12, and you roll a set of dice, whatever number appears, and you have a little house in the corner of one of those hexagons, you get a card representing a production of a raw material. And then you use those raw materials to build roads and to build houses and to build cities. And it was the first time in my life that I ever really encountered something. And the minute it was done, like, I'm not a board gamer. I'm not a person who I did play chess competitively a little bit, but that is a totally different world. I was so enraptured by this game. The first thing I said was, I want to do it right. I just want to do it immediately. And so that weekend was characterized by playing that game. And then the very first thing I did when we got back from that retreat was go to the store and buy the game, and went on to, after we were in Germany, we was in seminary and taught all these seminarians the game, and we used to play it during chapel, and we developed a speed version of it, and I have a hand-painted version of the game. And it threw me into this world that I'd never been in. And if you haven't figured out by now, I don't do anything I try not to do things halfway. If I'm going to be involved in something, I dive into it. And so I started buying games, and this was in 2002, so 20 years ago. I sort of just started playing more and more games, and Judah was young, and I wanted him to play games, so we started introducing to him. And as things went on, I then started, as my collection of games grew, and I was being exposed to these different dynamics. I never, people just sort of playing games. I never really thought about games, but then I started to design. I wondered if I could design a game. So I started tinkering, and I think my first full-blown game was called Smugglers International, and you were smuggling birds and turtles and things from other countries into Western countries. I have the board upstairs if you want to see it. But in that process, I started thinking more just about how games were put together, and games are very much like recipes. In the sense of what makes good cooking is you have different techniques, you have all these ingredients, and when you how you pull those together and intersect them together, and how the techniques you use produces a result. Well, the same thing is true for games. There are all these mechanics of games, and when you pull them together and you put a theme on them and some graphic design around them and create an experience for someone, then you basically are eating a meal, but it's a game. And when I started realizing the time and process, I just sort of got more and more involved. Well, I dabbled with that when I was in New Wilmington, and then I went to the national office. And while I was in the national office, I eventually got to the place where I do things that I just wanted to do because they were fun. And we always went expoing, and instead of handing out a pen that said, "From the Office of Christian Formation," that would cost me $1.25 I decided I was going to start designing games for the national office. So my first little card game was called UGrad. And it's just a college game for college students. Our ministry is called UKirk. And it just took a simple mechanic of sort of eliminating players, and it's not really worth playing. But I was able to, and then this was $1.22 to print, and we gave these to our college ministries, and so they could give them to their students. And basically, it's a game that has students. It has the college experience wrapped up in the cards. And basically you have two cards in your hand or three cards in your hand at the start of the game, and you play a card and it causes a reaction. So sophomore, it says, can I borrow your notes? It says, take one random card from any other player's hand into yours. So can I borrow your notes? Get it? See, there's a little, so in other words, so then I would play that, and then I could take someone's card, and the goal is to remain in the game. And if you if you have to play your last card, then you're out of the game. The last one standing wins. And it was designed to be a college game for college students to sort of grease the wheels when new students come in. If you're playing a game, it's something that's inviting to others, and allows them to step into that. We reskinned it as a camp game. Called At Camp, and the idea was that we were going to carry on with this. Now, side note, as I was getting ready for today, I started thinking, there was a hiker in here, I started thinking, hey, this is actually like it could be a 16 card game. And I was actually toying around with the idea, what if we reskinned that as a card game for the trail that hikers and hiker centers could carry. That experience digging into it led me to a place where I started digging around in what is play. And I'll pause there and interject to sort of and I started looking at it more from started from more of a philosophical level. Because I started reading about games, and games often talk about play and the spirit of play and the spirit of joy and what happens in games. And just games themselves, I could teach, I'd love to teach about for hours, because when you start talking about games, you get into the idea of what role do they play in our cultural expression. For a long time and for many years, Americans were not gamers. Your generation, not that they didn't play games, but we are in a gaming renaissance that 500 to 600 games are coming out every single year in America and worldwide. But
is that electronic?
No, just tabletop and card games, board games, about 500 to 600 a year. And there's a slog of it from pandemic sort of backlog that never came out.
The reason there was no games is because people were involved in football, baseball. That was the thing.
Yeah. Well, and we didn't have, American games are very combative. So American games are things, if you think about American games are either economic or military based, like in the era of sort of the 50s through the 70s, where the last sort of era of culture would have contributed to games. And war games are zero sum. If we're playing Risk, in order for me to win, I'm going to obliterate all of your stuff. In order for me to win Monopoly, I'm going to obliterate all of your stuff. So many of there's a zero sum. Either you win, everyone else loses. And so in order for me to win, it has to go like this. Or they were economic games that did the same. One, Monopoly is more of an economic game, obviously Risk being war. Those are just two iconic ones. And you follow that through in various levels of gaming, you'll see the same thing. Whereas in 1979, the Germans decided, and honestly, if you look at the history of Germany in terms of the evolution of their culture after World War II, there was a reconstruction of who they wanted to be, and there was an intentionality that came out. And it's really interesting because when I lived there in the early 2000s, and apparently we were there for the World Cup, and it was the first time, we were told by so many people, this is the first time we've seen German flags being waved in their lifetime. Mm-hmm. Because of the ramification. There was such a sort of squashing of any sort of national pride in Germany. But there are lots of articles about how Germany really tried to refashion its culture and its economy and its world persona out away from World War II and Nazi and the Fourth Reich and all that sort of stuff. And part of the way they did it is in 1979, they developed, there were some gaming critics that wanted to bring about a more robust gaming culture in Germany. So they developed a word that they called the Spiel des Jahres, which just translates the game of the year. And it's a German game of the year. It's like they didn't care about the rest of the world. This is like, in Germany, we want to cultivate gaming. So they developed this game, and I was supposed to do an exhibit here. But after this whole summer, I talked to the Art Center. We'll just do it in the summer next year. We want to do it where we actually get a crowd. This is actually kind of interesting. But So for 43 years, they've been awarding this. It's the most prestigious game in the world, gaming award in the world. Anything that wins it is presumed to will sell 200,000 to 300,000 copies, which in the gaming world, that's, you know, a pretty good chunk of games. Most games are probably top out about 10 to 20,000. Oh, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, not just and actually dominates. Have you all heard of Kickstarter, right?
No.
You've never heard of it? Are you being sarcastic?
No.
Do you know what like GoFundMe or crowdsourcing?
Oh,
Okay. So the Kickstarter actually started crowdsourcing. GoFundMe is a little bit more personal, like, hey, I know you, come support me. Kickstarter is for products. So music albums to produce books. We'll get the gaming world caught on to that. And there are many games because so many games are small run prints. We'll go to Kickstarter, run, you know, but Kickstarter have you ever heard the game Exploding Kittens? It's a stupid game.
Yeah.
It's like a dumb Uno. If you like it, I'm sorry, but it's not my favorite. Not even close. I did own it at one time, and I don't let go of games very easily, so I was happy to get rid of that one. But it was the largest Kickstarter crowd-supported project ever at that time. I don't know if it's still true. In the history of Kickstarter, it raised over like $8 million. In fact, yeah, and they were like so far. I heard a podcast that they were so far behind in production because they had contracted some little company to do this card game that they thought they would have 20,000 copies. But it was like 800,000 copies or something like that. And they went to all these major firms to say, could you print this? And they couldn't. So they were way behind in the production. But they eventually got it out. Now it's one of Target's most popular games. And so there are lots of games that do that, sell millions. Uno is probably the most popular game known worldwide. And there are lots of other ones that fall into that category. All that's to say is we, sort of in the 2000s, when Settler of Catan won that award in 95, and when that, over the next 5 years, it sort of led into the early 2000s to 2005, that game has shaped, and it's called the gate, sort of the iconic gateway game that people play, and they're like, I didn't know games could exist in this context. Like, and when you think back, because most of us don't either have bad experiences, you seem to like Monopoly. That's something.
I liked okay, I grew up with games.
So, but you know, but the thing is that parents don't like playing games with children often because Candyland is not fun. It's not even really a game. It's a simulation. You line the people up, you shuffle the cards, you flip them over, and you move them. A monkey could actually learn if they could tell their colors apart, could do it, and we could just all watch.
I was very good at that.
But I'm sorry to tell you, you had no choice. And so someone actually has defined a game by an activity that you have choice. Like there's some aspect of volition. It's using your executive function to think about what am I doing in this case. So for example, if we took the game of Candyland, which you all know very well, right? It's a path you go on, you have little colored candy gingerbread people. You flip a color over with a square on it and you move into the next one.
Chutes and Ladders is like that.
Chutes and Ladders is a teeny bit better, but only by non-existent hair.
But there's no choice in that. I mean, it's just
I think there isn't there?
dice.
Don't you get to choose sometimes a path or not a path or something?
If you land on the one, you get to go
Yeah.
for it.
But in Candyland, you get a color and you don't choose. There's nothing. You mean, you know, in fact, it's horrible spin wheel and you get to watch in excitement as it lands on something and that's what you get. Whereas Candyland, once the minute you shuffle that deck, that's it. It's determined. But if I said to you, what happens if I gave everyone 2 cards? And then they had 2 cards in their hands and then they would draw a card from the blind deck and they would hold that in their hand and then they get to look at their cards and they say, which one do I want to use to play my person for? What you've done in that simple action is give the player a sense of volition and choice and agency. And in doing so, you've developed all of some, activity in their mind thinking, what should I do? Should I go to this one? Oh, if I go that far, then I've missed this shortcut path. So I don't want to play the purple because I'll go too far. So maybe I want to play this blue one and hope that I get the color that I need to land on this. All of a sudden, just by giving a couple cards, you could even just do it with 1 and they draw 1, or you could put 3 cards out and they get to choose which one they want. By giving someone choice, you've now all of a sudden created all sorts of new synapses in their brains. let's pause for a moment. Just consider that benefits of games. And is one of the things I like to stress, both in young people and in aging people. The cognitive effects that happen when you sit down to a new game, the results of engaging every single time. So I have close to up there, I guess total, I have over 500 games. That means there's more than one a year. Every day you would come here, you could play a new game, you could sit down. And every single time you sit down to a new game, you are given a new objective. Get this many victory points, collect this many token, get, whatever it might be. The goal to win the game is described. This is how you're going to do it. You're going to use these techniques, these mechanisms, this rearrangement, this puzzle on the board, rearranging these shapes, building this, tearing this down. This is how you're going to interact with the people at the table. Sometimes you can talk, sometimes you can't. Sometimes, what are you allowed to do? Are you allowed to see their cards, not see their cards? All of these things are spelled out. And then you're put into a situation where you're playing as if. You're playing as if you're settling a building. You're playing as if you're constructing towers. You're playing as if you're melting ice around the release gems, as we'll look at in a moment. But every single time you sit down to do one of those, it means your brain is reshaping itself around an existing thing and being forced to think about what actually it means to engage in that. So this is one of the things I think we teach our students a lot of things in high school and in their primary education that they will never remember. They will not remember, probably most of them, their chemical formulas or how to do things in, math formulas, or even in many cases, because we know most of our young people these days don't know how to write. Even how to construct basic English sentences in English sometimes, or spell, because we're all product of spelling, autocorrect.
I would say that's a skill that can be taught and mastered.
I absolutely
Having done so.
can, and I think it takes discipline. I think, but the idea behind it is that we don't teach often our kids to think. Critical thinking. How do I solve this issue? How do I overcome this? And you have to use creativity and innovation and take different parts of your brain and put them together in ways that you just don't normally in everyday life. Whereas going to school, and I'm not downing on school by any stretch of the imagination. I think obviously we take education seriously in my home, but Silas learning what Shannon is teaching him isn't him solving problems necessarily. Sometimes it is. But every single time you sit down to a new game, you have to think, how do I go about solving this problem? And so every single time, it means your brain's wrapping around, and there are all sorts of different connections that are going on. So then not only that, but say physiologically in your body, your heart rate, it gets your blood pumping, it gets your endorphins going. You're having, oftentimes in games, you're having new interactions with the people you're with. You're having you think about how when you've watched a movie together, sometimes it's sort of a shared experience and you feel like you've just sort of had an emotional or encounter experience together. Well, gaming is the same way. I mean, some more games than others. Some are goofy, some are simple, some are, but there are games where when you're done, you're sort of like, wow, that was an experience. And you've had this encounter, and then you spend the next hour talking. When we play Roots on Friday night over in Darley all through the winter, after every game, there's 30 minutes of discussion about the game. And there's like, yeah, what about when you did this? And how about that? And these are creating lasting memories. They're building relationships, again, endorphin release, mental stuff. And now think about that in terms of older ages. We don't, you get into the habit of doing, the older you get, the very same thing all the time. No new challenges. Yes, you may play Sudoku, you may do crossword puzzles, but it's exact exercising the exact same part of your brain every time. I mean, it's good to, that's not that you say you shouldn't do those things, are great, but we know that gray matter decreases in the elderly brain, and playing board games has shown tremendous production of gray matter in your hippocampus, because you're remembering things, you're engaging in things, you sit back down again, you remember what you played last time. In fact, one of the things that I hope, once I get everything in this world that I live in here in order in my head, and well, I mean, just, sort of, there's a lot, we have a lot of things that we still got to do. At some point in the next 10 years, I would love to approach Lilly out of Indiana, Lilly Foundation, which is an organization that is, grants billions of dollars all over. place. But there is formation intersects with relationality and with education in general and spirituality. I would love to write a grant application for, I don't know, $1 million or something to put gaming programs in adult living communities. And to have the participants who agree to do that, they would, have to agree to play so many games a week and engage with a certain gaming group. And I don't know if I'd teach them or I would figure out how it all is done, but to do a cognitive test on the physiological test, a memory test, all these tests around them cognitively, and then have them engage in this program for a year and then test them on those things at the other end. And I guarantee, just from everything I've read and all the studies that I've done around just gaming in general, it would be a dramatic difference. If you spend
beyond bingo, which is common in those places.
It is, and bingo really doesn't require any thought other than recognition of numbers.
Because I think, I took my dog to, as a therapy dog, to a nursing home.
Oh, yeah.
For some years, and I observed what was going on in there. They did puzzles, they did do simple games. A lot of them were cognitively impaired, so it was hard to get much.
And the greatest thing about having 600 new games produced every single year is I could find a game for any situation, for any interest. You want to talk about legal games. There are games that tap into the whole law system, and you're trying to, there's one upstairs called I think it's called The Last Will, and it's like, you remember the movie Brewster's Millions, where he has to spend all of the money in order to get all the money. It's that concept in a game, and it's got all the legal jargon around it. Like any industry that there's all sorts of stuff that are out there that really just, not everything, but like there are so many games out there that it's very easy. And even in cases where you have learning disabilities, there are games that come in at levels. Honestly, so this game, I don't know if you can see it back here. It's a great example. I'll come over here and show you. This Dragon's Breath game, if you can see, it's just a box that has some holes in the top and there's some holes back here. And what you're doing is there are 5 colors of gems. I don't know if you all can see that. I don't know where the camera is over here. And you would go around the circle and you look at it and you'd be like, I think that there will be more red gem. When I pull this ring up, which is the dragon melting the ice, that's the theme. When I pull this ring up, how many of those gems do I think are going to fall? And the color I choose are the color that I collect. And in the end, whoever has the most wins. So at the end, after everyone goes around and takes whatever color, blue, yellow, red, purple, they then lift that up and gems fall. And if I have this yellow one, and it goes in my little cubby down here. If you have children, it is the most fantastic. Grandchildren that you want to buy gifts for. It was the game of the year in, I think, 2019 for children. And it is, and so I used to lead gaming workshops in the denomination. I would go and I'd speak at I would speak to a church on the theology of play. And usually when I did this, I would say, hey, here's a list of games I want you to order. And because we didn't take honorariums, so I'd have them spend like $500 and create a game library for the Presbyterian church. Well, we did that, and we had, I don't know, 50 people playing games at night and playing all sorts of games. And at the end of the night, we're cleaning up, and I hear the youth director, or maybe he was a pastor, I don't know, but saying to the intern, these are both like one's like in his 30s or something, and one's in his 20s, say, they're talking about the games that they play that night, and I hear him describe and say, well, it's a game called Dragon's Breath, and you lift up this ring, and you have to guess which ones fall. And he was describing it with such enthusiasm, and it's a child's game.
What's the age range on that? Do you know?
I have never.
Usually a
game that they don't choke on if they can't.
No, but it usually says ages this to this for most games.
It's probably 5. I guess 5 to 99, probably because it's just the pieces of dexterity, and you need color recognition. But Haba is that's Haba. And that's a great game company. They do a lot with age and stage development and learning. So they stage their games where they are actually appropriate to be. But just sort of pointing out other games, since we're talking about the creativity side of it, we're over here. This is Santorini, the famous Greek isle. And you are this is actually a mathematical game that won an award. Is this showing? Am I showing you? And all you're doing is on your turn, there's these little people that go with it. On your turn, you can move your person and then you place one of these pieces. And you have a base and you have a middle piece and you have an upper piece, and that's 3 tiers. And so as you play, you can move your little figure up one or down as many as you want. But once it's capped, you can't move anymore. And it's a mathematically sound game. Actually, I've thought about actually making one for the yard because it's just really an amazing. And then what you're trying to do is get your person onto the 3rd level. Fascinating games, 2 or 3 player game, or you can play it in 4 teams. But one of the best games, Judah wanted a few games to take with him to school. And this was one of them because it's just, over here you have something called Colt Express. And I rolled that out because it's got a nice presentation, but it's basically an ordering game. And you are little cowboys and you're robbing a stagecoach. And you have cards that have actions. These are the actions I'm doing, and it goes around the circle, and then you flip all the cards over, and then people take the actions. And you can choose who you're going to shoot, who you're going to punch, if you're going to grab a bag of gold, if you're going to run from one carriage to the other. And so, but again, totally different gaming mechanic, but it's 3D, it's interactive. And then the last one over here, and you're welcome to come, is called Niagara. And if I pull back, it'll display it, but a little bit better. But what happens in this, I don't know if you guys can see this online, is after you take your actions, you're trying to collect these gems, then you push these little tiles down the path, and they, I got too many things going on here, but they basically knock a ship. So you're trying to collect gems, and then go back and take them and drop them off up here. And so all this to say, and I use these examples as the world of gaming has taken, whitewater rafting and robbing a train and a dragon breathing on a column of ice and a famous island and a mathematical game. They've taken all these things and just blown out the creativity and the innovation and the logic and the stimulation that comes from these things. And this is starting to seed in culture, but it's still a very, very small industry, even in a giant, culture like ours. You don't see that many people, I probably seem like a rarity, like who's this guy who likes all these games? There's lots of people who love them, and we collect them and we buy them and we play them more like we do like a movie. You buy a DVD and you watch it once or twice and then you put it on your shelf and you probably never watch it again. I mean, that's what happened with DVD culture. We can now own these movies and we sort of collect the DVDs. Well, the same thing is happening, or books for that matter, but the same thing is happening with games. People buy them, they play them once or twice, they get a feel of them. If they really like them, they play them a lot. Otherwise, they sort of sit on the shelf. And this is part of I was going to thin my collection, but I was like, no. When I found out I was coming here, I was like, I'll have to open it up in the game library. At least someone will be using them. So all that's to say, let's pick up the story. This explosion of games happened in the last, to the intensity that it is in the last 10 years. So you are in the midst of this, what's going on in this gaming world. What's that?
Had no idea.
Well, no, it's a niche, it's a little niche world too, but it's one that's a multi-billion-dollar industry. I mean, the fact that, and so this, the fact that I can, with my MacBook Air in no graphics program, put a game together. I mean, every single thing I did on this was designed on, for those of you who are Mac users, on Pages. The little Microsoft Word, the word processing. See, I even put myself in the game. This is me as a child. Yeah, but this all, let's say, let me go back. This led to me sort of saying, what is it to play? And philosophically, there's a wrestling with play. There's someone who did a workshop that it was a conference called "How do I?" What is it? How do playing games when Rome is burning? In other words, how do I indulge in this frivolous activity when there's so much tragedy and turmoil in the world around? How do I free myself so that I feel, because it feels almost pointless sometimes to play a game. You feel like it's just sort of wasting time. I'm not doing anything productive. And because of that, there's a burdensome nature of it. And if you look at sort of the heart of what play is, one, there's several definitions. One say it's as playing as if, it's like the child running around the house, roaring like a lion. And you say, why is she roaring like a lion? And she's like, because she's playing. There's no reason. Play, there's something internal to the value of play to itself that we often don't get because we want to assign a value, an extrinsic value to play. This will accomplish this. Whereas the same thing in a game. Why do we play a game? Not because when I settle the island of Catan or have chosen wisely the most gems that will be there when the column of plastic ice is melted, but because in that moment I am engaged in an activity that has a value of joy that is offered unto itself. When you were running, I'm sure when you were playing Nerf, that's a form of play. We're running around playing as if we're at battle or war or zombies or whatever we were doing the night we were doing. But in the moment where you're coming out at the kid going, like you're a zombie, you're playing as if you're a zombie. And there's something exuberant and life-giving about this sort of activity. Philosophers have recognized it, sociologists have recognized it. But the fact of the matter is we live in a culture where play just is not really valued. We see play, and we have not only have we've commodified play. So we've taken things like soccer and basketball and peewee, and little league and dance and ballet and musical instruments and all of these things that for so many centuries didn't have a goal of accomplishing and getting you into college or getting you a scholarship. At the end of it, it was just, why do you play the piano? Why do you play the harp? Why do you play the flute? Because it produces music, because in the moment of playing something where it comes out well and there's a sense of excellence, there's a sense of lifting culture and lifting our spirits and finding a deeper sense of joy that we don't. The challenge is that because we have made play almost either commercialized or commodified as an end result. And I like to see, when I did many years of youth ministry, I always said you can play sports, you can do all these things. And most of the time, they don't really lead to anything. They don't. I mean, they're not that they're bad. I mean, you're learning teamwork, you learn discipline. There's important things that you learn from those. But what we often do, and this is the challenge really of a larger public school system, is oftentimes we reduce play to going out on the playground, and we forget that play is a part of the human spirit. And play doesn't have that extrinsic value as an intrinsic value, an internal value, that doing it isn't doing it itself. It's I like to compare that it's the Mary Martha thing. Martha was like, we got to work, we got to take care of Jesus. We have a goal. We can't let down our gift of hospitality. We have to do this. And Mary was just like, no, I'm going to just dwell at the feet of my master and be present. So without going into the whole philosophy of play, and there's all sorts of things around the philosophy of play, and play is used right now in therapy. It's used in social movements in terms of, there's a whole book called Locally Played, and it's about how to use gamification to change culture through programs, and it's really fascinating. There's stuff about the psychology of it. There's books about the nature of play in gamification. One of the fascinating stories about McDonald's is they were trying to do this big boost. I think it was in the 80s or something like that. You all remember when the very first Monopoly McDonald's on the fries cups you peel off and you get the little sticker. I don't remember the whole story. I should go back and look at it for the amount of times I've cited it. But the essence of it is that they were struggling to do a promotion, and when they got the idea to gamify it, you just get this little sticker that you stick on your little board that you should get there. It exploded. It was the first time a major marketing corporation used, and rather than the sweepstakes, which appeals more to like a bingo raffle mentality than it does actually a game, but it encouraged purchasing, so you get the little game pieces so you can build this thing and you might win, and you can win food, and other things. They gamified it. So since that time, you've seen this increasing gamification of culture, and there's all sorts of things that are gamified. In fact, I went out to the most recent, Shannon last weekend was out at the artist talk thing at the lake, and they had Yana, someone who was an artist that they came down, and she was talking about how she had a series of art that she did where she limited herself to this type of medium. Each medium only got one stroke, meaning she couldn't lift it up off the paper. Once she started, she had to continue. Once, and I don't think there was a couple of rules around it. But after I came up to her, I said, "Do you realize? Do you know? Have you ever read anything like gamification?" And she said, "No." I said, "Well, you gamified the art project." Because games are often defined, not play, but games are defined by having set boundaries. So if someone can steal from the bank in Monopoly and that's kosher to the game, that's not fun. When we play Nerf, like I stressed in the beginning, if you get hit with one of those balls and you don't say I'm out, you're cheating, that's not fun. The rules and limits are what define how we play within boundaries. So this concept really fascinated me because it took me back to the garden. What does it mean to truly be free? And this is where ultimately I'm getting to, is that what is a theology of play? Well, theology of play, like any theology, is a discussion of how a concept in a human intervention or dialogue about or relationship around something relates to the divine. So the question we ask in a theology of play is, does God care if we play? Does God play? Does God play with us other than, messing with us at times? But, and so and because of Sabbath, other stuff, and because of other, in my theological world, I've spent a lot of time studying the Imago Dei, or the image of God. And if you look back and actually, since we are doing a Bible study, Karen, would you mind looking up Genesis 1, 26 and 27? And we can.
Maybe.
But I turned to when we were created. When there was a book called Homo Ludens instead of Homo sapien, or beings. It was beings that play, Homo Ludens. Instead of human beings, it was human playing. Or, in other words, like ludens is the Latin word for the root for play. You had, I think it's 26 and 27.
Yeah. God spoke, "Let us make human beings in our image, make them reflecting our nature, so they can be responsible for the fish in the sea, the birds in the air, the cattle, and yes, earth itself, and every animal that moves on the face of the earth."
So we have in this very simple verse a pretty profound aspect of creation. I wouldn't say the most important thing about creation. The most important thing about creation is that it all came from nothing, out of God's creative power. But then we have this case where God says, "Let us," and I think it's important to name that there's a plurality of God even in that Hebrew text. "Let us make humans," or man, Adama, and that's how we get the name Adam, from Adama, meaning earth. That let us make them in our own female. Second creation narrative, you get the male and female differentiation, but in the Genesis 1 account, let us make humans in our image, let's make man in our image, and in our likeness. Now, there's been a much theological debate over the years what those things are, but generally speaking, God's image throughout the history of theology has been understood as rationality, the cognitive capacity to intellectually understand something, the relationality that we have to one another in terms of how we relate, and also included in that the image of God coming out in some essence of cognitive communication, self-awareness. Animals aren't self-aware, and a lot of this has to do with differentiating who we are in relationship to animals. They're not rational; they're instinctual. They don't have the ability to choose, make choices. And so, they do make choices, but more to them in an instinctual way. And we can train them. I can tell Louis, come here when I'm showing him the treat. And yes, he is making a decision, but somewhere in his animalistic brain, he's not really making a decision. He's following pain and pleasure patterns to figure out which one ultimately wins. Now, you might say and make the argument that they love us so much, that's why they choose to obey us. But the reality is really they associate coming to us with some form of pleasure, because we originally gave them the treat till we pulled the treat. Now we're praising them but we're triggering something in their brain that's causing them to do that. Humans don't operate like that. We can overcome that. So the ability to step outside of the animalistic nature and make decisions. Creativity. Not that animals don't have creativity, not that animals don't have the capacity to create, but the creativity in the way, I mean, think about how creative humans are, for crying out loud. We have satellites in the air that communicate to these little things that transmit all sorts of things that we've created around the world. We have microchips in our, sitting on our wristwatches that, have more sophistication than the space shuttle did 50 years ago. What we've done in this world is absolutely fascinating and amazing, and there's no way to downplay the immense creativity that we've been given, and apes don't do that. So we're distinguished. So these are the image of God in us. And the idea behind is that during the fall, when we fell, the image of God was not taken from us, but was marred. They say that we use some 6 to 7% of our brain. Could you imagine what our brains would be like if we could use 80%? Could we intersect? Do we have within the capacity of our brain somewhere unlock the capacity to interact with the material world? I was just reading a passage that said, Christ said, if you had the faith like a mustard seed, you could tell this plant to go and be in the ocean and it would. Now, either Jesus is just yanking their chains, or Jesus really is sort of foreshadowing the power of human capacity when we are not in a fallen state. And this goes back to why I see Jesus zapping in and out of walls and appearing places out of nowhere and ascending and flying in the air as being the fullness of humanity as Adam and Eve were given to some extent in the paradise narrative.
What about our creativity?
Yes, so creativity.
Isn't that part of that we're doing now?
Absolutely.
And prayer, we move things with our prayer.
We do.
So it's happening.
It is happening. And I would say that the recovery of the Holy Spirit 2,000 years ago is what has caused all of this. I don't think that was possible. So you have the fallen state of Adam and Eve, and then their capacities were, not that they were gone, still had choice, they still had will, but they were weak. They were to succumb to their human flesh. And I think there was an enfleshment process, and they were then slaves to their flesh because every day was about survival. In the garden, there was no fear of survival. Fruit was there to eat. And the God and the creator of all frolicked in the garden with them. I like to always joke, God's original intent was to hang out with a bunch of naked vegetarians. So when I think of, when it says God walked in the cool of the evening, I like to think of that as a frolicking. I like to think of that as a playing. Not that they were like playing a game or playing badminton or anything like that, but there was a spirit of joy and of playfulness and of presence. The same thing that taps into us. And so all that's to say is, I think that there is a spirit of play that was also given to us in that image of God, and we don't often talk about that. Now, the aside before I go too far is the likeness, image and likeness. The likeness is often referred to as the righteousness or the holiness of Adam and Eve, and when they fell, that was removed. So we lost the likeness, and the image of God was marred or depraved, as we say often, total depravity. We are totally depraved in everything of who we are in the Reformed context. But I think that now that we can strive towards holiness, now we can have more of that likeness. Now we are recovering, as you're saying, in this present day. Like, that's what I'm saying, look at the creativity around us. That is because of the recovery of the Imago Dei in us. So how does this play thing work? Well, here's this. When I just described a few minutes ago playing a board game, what is a board game? If we were to sit down and play a game, well, a board game engages our ability to make choices, our understanding of logic and rationality and rules and how they all fit together and how they're structured together in a reasonable manner. We relate to one another in unique ways and challenging ways that we have to overcome and maneuver and manipulate. We communicate with one another. We exercise innovation and creativity, obviously, in the production of games, but even in the playing of games, our creative minds are. So much of what happens in a board game taps into all of those other elements that historians and theologians have described the Imago Dei with through the last 2,000 years. A board game touches on the way that we have conceptualized the Imago Dei in a way, here's my mic drop moment that I do when I teach about this in a way that we often, I'm guilty of this too, don't do in worship. And when we think about worship as the collective gathered people, the highlight of our week, the moment where we're meant to sort of be in the fullness of who we are, how often is our, I mean, you know, maybe in my teaching, you might get some, you're challenging your thinking, you're thinking about things from a different way, but we often aren't using our creativity. We often aren't using innovation. We are sometimes using some self-reflection. We aren't often engaging. We often are in a participatory mode. And I think we do a decent job of that. I think the Presbyterian Church within the liturgy, we speak, I try to engage different ways of, you know, it's not by chance, it's by thought that we say, okay, what does it mean to, why do we read so much in the scripture? Why do we read so much in a worship service? Because it's meant to tap into different parts of learning. We're reading together, we're confessing together, we're passing peace in a physical way by standing up, we're passing plates, whether it be communion or offering. We're engaging in these practices that physically are doing things us, but do they really tap into a spirit of play? I would argue no. And I think that's probably why, in large part, I try to integrate play in a lot of other aspects, and nerve things that became singing, I think would probably be the closest thing. I think that we, and if we're doing it with that sense of being in the moment, sometimes we just sing and our minds are like, after dinner, I have to get the chicken out of the oven. I'm going to do that. You know, we can sing, we can read these words because we've done them. We can do it sort of in rote memory. But what I've noticed and what I've loved about, honestly, this summer in general, is after teaching about the hymns all summer, as we have returned into the sanctuary, you can feel there's a power, there's a joy, and there's a participation in the way we're singing. And I would say we're singing those playfully. And that's not to say that we can't. I think, one of the challenges I have in my own life is to say, what does it mean to have more moments of joy and playfulness in a worship gathering? I'm also wrestling with the fact as I this past year, the Hartmans and the Humphreys were sort of toying with our congregation, saying, and I think they still are to some extent, but I'm facing the reality of what happens if we have this regular context of young people in our church. Is the way I'm preaching just meeting people on one level, or do I need to rethink how we're actually using that time as a means of formation? But I think that I could still mix it up a little, get jiggy with it.
We were noticing, because we are able, because of the time zone difference, to watch my church's service back home. And I know you've got this thing about intergenerational worship and everything, but they have the kids come up to the front, a small group. We don't have that.
Yeah, like children's hour or children's
message.
Moment.
But there can be a lot of fun in those children's messages that the whole congregation gets to hear.
Yeah.
And those kids, they pop off with funny things, and yet the core of the adult sermon is present in the story for the children, or the pictures, or the objects that the kids are shown, or that's kind of like almost playtime for the whole group.
You'd be surprised at how many people report, both on surveys and just sort of in conversation, as ministers will say, oh, after we, people come up to, I love children's message. I get so much out of the children's message. And it shows you that in some sense we've intellectualized. I mean, honestly, I think that sometimes that having in the midst of service where that sermon normally fits, may be something that is more playful, if and only if the whole congregation then after that service went over to, like what if we did that and then we went over to an adult education hour and then we did break the kids into smaller groups, but then we would have all been together doing something together, engaging together. But then this more intellectual, rigorous sort of look at this text would happen over here. Because quite frankly, if I get 20 minutes to talk about a sermon, this past sermon this weekend about the rich man and Lazarus, I got 15, 20 minutes to kind of frame it and grab a theological point and provide some background. And I'm just sort of speaking, either passive listening or engaged listening, whichever happened at that moment. But if I had an hour, well, we could talk about that text and we would read it, maybe a couple different versions. We'd share what other people thought about it. I sort of shaped that idea, provide some background. We we communicate about that. Which do you think is more formative?
Yeah, but that's what we tried to do in Bible study. What
Essentially,
you're talking about
yes.
is we do in Bible study. There's still some value in doing a formal, because people are used to that. They know.
No, I agree,
And that's what they
100%.
want.
I 100% what they want, but at the same time, I also say, if the goal of formation is to experience some sense of joy in what you're doing, and not that I'm not, trust me, I enjoy preaching, I enjoy teaching, so I have no problem with standing up and doing. But the reality is, as I see younger faces come in, it does give me pause to say, what does it mean to also? What does it mean for a child to also hear the gospel? And it may be in a children's message. It may be in a alternative sermon where we, do something creative. In other words, I think that the traditional preached moment is always there. I don't want to get too far off topic, but the idea behind it is that playing a game taps into sometimes our capacities that God has given us in the image of God more than sometimes the aspects of traditional Christian formation or worship. And I think that's tragic. I think youth group tries to capture some of that. Not that everything happens in youth group I would condone, but I think youth group or youth ministries or children's ministries have tried to tap into other means of learning and other ways of experiencing and recognizing that a larger communal environment, but this is also the case that we're wrestling with, just to put it in real terms, is the fact that, we live in a context that really wants certain church to be over in about an hour. I face that
I love the
every
way-
week.
I love the way you bring play into the sermon with your sense of humor. Scrumptious. I mean, you never know what you're gonna say.
Well, and I think that probably just comes from, I think I have always been somewhere in my spirit sort of a playful person. And so that just naturally is a part of, but the challenge is what happens if you have a pastor that doesn't have that sense of playfulness. But and this is what I'm talking about though, but think about how enlivened you are when you do get to experience play. And the joy, so a guy named Jürgen Moltmann, who's a theologian from the last century, wrote all sorts of stuff. He wrote this big tome called Theology of Play, and then was reading. I'm still trying to convince one of my professors to let me have. She has one. Their copies are like $400. They're like it's way out of print. But then he wrote it. He rewrote a summary of it in a book called Theology of Joy. And I say all of that to say we were created to be creatures of joy. What God intended for us in the garden, to live and to experience a state of joy. And we find ourselves in life often weighed down by so much. And we can't find that joy. Or maybe we get a glimpse of that joy at a Sunday morning service, or maybe we don't. But I think I don't want to say that I'm in the business of, what's that?
Fishing.
Well, yeah, no, but then there's a playful, and actually that's a perfect method. There's a playfulness in fishing that I love. There's an intersection, there's a thinking, there's an engaging, unless you're sort of trawling it. That's always fun to reel them in. But maybe less playfulness than when you're trying to angle at them. But all of that it's the spirit of play. You feel alive. And in a redeemed world where Christ has called us as children of light, where we're meant to exemplify that light and that joy. Could you imagine if everyone who claimed to be a follower of Christ actually was embodied by a spirit of joy?
That's the second gift of the Holy Spirit.
And
It's very prominent in that list of gifts.
In play, I would say, is one of the primary avenues that we have to joy. And when I see people learning to play games, when I see people playing games, when people are laughing and enjoying, when we did this conference on theology of play, I was pick back up and then we'll end here. I love seeing people engage in joyful activity. That's why I lead the Nerf thing. Not because I want at 9 o'clock on a Friday night. Every week I'm like, I go over there and do this. Why did I even decide to do this? I'm grumbling to myself because I'm usually tired by that time.
I was doing the same.
But by the time I'm done and I'm leaving, my adrenaline's rushing. I'm just I'm thrilled that I did it. Yeah, you're right. I do. It's a rough night of sleep. So all that's to say, in my own life, where that's led to is, just to close this out, is I gathered together a group of game designers who were loosely connected to Presbyterian worlds or Presbyterians who were dabbling time. I did a Theology of Play conversation in Portland, Oregon in 2017. In 2018. In 2019, I did a Theology of Play conference where I brought a game designer in, my favorite game designer from Australia, who I still call my best friend, although he doesn't admit he is mine. No, I brought him up, and we spent 4 days together with about 40 some people in the denomination, playing games and talking about Theology of Play. My first year here, and the first year of COVID, I led an online 13-hour conference. I don't know if you remember me mentioning that. I led it up there, where we played roll and write games, kind of. And when I arrived here, that's what I started. I mean, it was one of those things that I didn't know what else to do. I was planning on playing games. We played these roll and write games where I show a card to the screen and they, on their own sheets, mark stuff out. Some of you might have played these before. And it was a means and a way for us to connect. And I was building relationships with people I couldn't otherwise really hang out with because of COVID. All that's to say is that from that first conference, this is the game, and you all online can't do this. Once we hang up, we'll play a round of it. You'll have to do it when next time you're in town. But out of that conference, I produced a game called At Church. And what's fun about it is it's designed with a real sense of intergenerational formation as a part of it. And as I was showing you earlier, these are the children are all in red. The teenagers are all in yellow. The young adults or the college students are all in green. The middle-aged adults are in blue, and the older adults with gray hair and white hair are in purple. And within each one of them, there's also an animal. And the fun thing about that is those antlers have hidden symbols in them. This is the symbol of the animal that we assigned to our Presbyterian young adult organization, parachurch ministry that supports the Presbyterian Church. The college one, we did a unicorn with the little U-Kirk logo as our college ministries. The adults, we did our camping conference ministries and put a fox. We integrated and they became the wild cards in it. But what the symbols are at the bottom are Christian practices. So storytelling, pineapple for hospitality. This little symbol that is also on my arm, this tattoo, thanks, Karen, is retreat. This little meeple is a service. The little thing is prayer. Big wave and a little wave, and then pause, a little pause sign is Sabbath, and then there's a wild. And so what we did is we integrated the idea of Christian formation into a card game with the idea of intergenerational Christian formation as being the most important. So the highest card hand you could have is if you had one of every color and all these matching symbols, you would score the highest points, because that means you had multiple generations doing the same Christian practice. And each one of these practices became an emphasis for the national office's focus on Christian education over the last few years, and it's still going today. So this has led, one of the things that I'd like to do is I'd like to eventually write something on Theology of Play, but I have not got to that point. I have a bunch of books that I need to read and go through, and it'll happen eventually. I haven't let go of it, but I've taken this concept of play and board games and I've integrated it into the life of our church, because I believe, not just because I like to play games, I enjoy playing games, but because I believe that there is physical benefits, there's relational benefits, there's cognitive and intellectual benefits, and I think there's spiritual benefits, because, and this is not all I'll end on, games are one of the very few things in our culture that are truly intergenerational. Yes, we can all watch a kids movie together. We can all go build a sandcastle. There are lots of little things we can all do together. But when children sit down to play a game with an adult, it is one of the few spaces in their lives where they actually are put on equal footing. And they actually could have an advantage and actually could win and beat an adult at something, as my son has demonstrated with me and many in the church time and time again. And where that sense of empowerment is almost unknown in a child's life. Church ought to be a place where we experience this mutuality, that sense of we're there together, and there's a reciprocity, and that sense of we're on the same. That goes back to, I don't want to just preach to the adults and ignore the kids. It means that the burden's on me as the pastor to figure out how am I going to do this differently. But games are one of the few things that we have in our culture where children and adults have a third thing that they can not just passively engage in our building relationships and the physical and emotional and all those other thing benefits that come along with it. So that's my ultimately my largest rationale for so to say, I hope I see you all playing games with us next summer. That's it. That's it.
What time do you play?
7.
7. You're right.
So
7 on what day?
on Mondays.
We
So,
could do it with Zoom too.
and we did, we used to do. All right. I think what time is it, Benjamin? Yep, we're way over time. And if you all want to stick around and play a short game, I'll play one with you. If not, you're welcome to go. Otherwise, Denny and Pat and George and Donna, thanks for joining us. And we will see you next time. Nope, I didn't know that.
Okay, good. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
See
Thank
you in
you
a few
all.
weeks.
Bye-bye, Donna.
And thank you all for your prayers. I've appreciated them.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you.